Hi, everyone. This is Rob Gray from ASU and the Perception in Action podcast, back with another article review. Today's episode is going to be start in a series of episodes that I want to do looking at papers that are making commentaries about the CLA and ecological dynamics. And this is going to relate to my new book coming out. I'm going to have an update on that at the end of this podcast. So, as the constraints-led approach in ecological dynamics is gaining popularity, not surprisingly, there's been, a little pushback, a little commentary, a little comments here and there, rightfully so, kind of questioning some of the parts of it. Some of the things I've seen, the common thing, why can't we just mix and match theories? So why can't we pick parts of ecological dynamics we like and parts of information-based internal model theories we like and mix them together when coaching? Why can't we use a kind of a it depends approach? Sometimes it's called. And there's some recent papers on that and some good blog articles on that. And I'll talk about that in coming episodes. I've also seen some commentaries on, saying that the constraints-led approach is too difficult for coaches, right? It requires too much knowledge and too much ability and too much skill, which is a weird comment. Coaching is a skill, right? Doesn't it acquire skill? Okay. But we'll come to that. The other thing I've seen comments that we can't investigate the constraints-led approach because it's not falsifiable as a theory, right? To that, I'll put up this figure, their daily reminder, right? All coaching is constraints-based coaching. All coaching involves manipulating Newell's constraints, right? Newell's constraints include things you say, equipment, size of the field, number of players, rules. There's nothing else you can manipulate as a coach other than the constraints, right? So Newell's constraints theory as a constraints manipulation as is true. That's not falsifiable because it covers all types of coaching, right? What differs is the purpose of the constraints-led approach, a purpose of this constraints manipulation. Whereas the CLA and things like differential learning, the goal is to manipulate the constraints to promote self-organization. And the traditional prescriptive internal model, information processing, whatever you want to call it, approach is to manipulate constraints to guide people towards an ideal technique, okay, when essentially restricting self-organization. So they have very different goals. So I strongly disagree with the idea that the constraints-led approach is not falsifiable. As a person that's published a few articles testing it, I don't agree with that at all. Right? Because it has a specific purpose. Right? Yes, constraint. As I mentioned, people can creep. That's why I don't like the term constraints manipulations. Constraints-based coaching, right? All coaching is constraints-based, right? Why are you talking about the CLA where you're trying to promote self-organization? Okay. So that's another issue. So I don't agree with that as well. The third one is the one I want to address today. People, it kind of relates to that second point I was talking, that the constraints-led approach is too difficult. The paper I'm going to talk about today is one I've seen a few things that the constraints-led approach, the theory and the research and the published articles on it, there's not enough guidance on how to use it, right? What types of constraints to use, when to change them, things like that, and so on. So I want to look at this paper, adding texture to the art of constraints-led coaching, a request for more research-informed guidelines, right? So putting a little more meat on the bone, or they say texture, the constraints-led approach. And I think that's fair purpose. This brings to mind, right, if you've been following kind of research in ecological dynamics, and you follow particularly the great work of Carl Woods, he's been talking more recently about a corresponsive sports science, right, where we kind of work together on both sides of the fence and interact more than the traditional way we publish, where we publish our theory, then you read it and publish your work, and then years later we respond to it, and it's not very efficient. This would have been a great example of this, I think, if these authors had worked with someone that could have answered these questions or pointed them to the research. But anyway, I think it's a fair question to ask, right? Can we get more guidance on using it? So I want to look through some of their comments and try to be fair to what their criticisms are. The first thing I will say is that a lot of these papers that critique the constraints-led approach in ecological dynamics in the past have really shown little effort into try to truly understand it. You can tell right away from some of the commentaries on, for example, papers published by Sean Mishkin, Tyler Yearby, and Keith. The commentaries, they don't really have put a very little effort into just understanding direct perception, attractor affordance, right? And that really comes through. These authors did a pretty good job, right, in explaining some of the things. They did a long start of the paper where they explain what ecological dynamics is and what the constraints of that approach is. I think maybe I'm wrong, and if I am, I'm sorry. I think it comes through. If you read between the lines, these people are not supporters of this approach. They don't believe in this approach. There's subtle little things that come through. Although they present a good description of it, there are also some subtle misunderstandings that come through. So that I'll point out along the way. But anyway, here's the paper, right? So the first thing they do is they point out that papers that talk about the constraints that approach very rarely, they constantly leaving out the criticisms of it, which I guess that's fair, right? I don't know of many papers that present an idea and the criticism of it together, but okay. So they point out three or four main criticisms. The first one is that ecological psychology, or more specifically direct perception, discounts human neuroscience research and rejects the notion of mental representations. I don't quite understand, especially that second part, how that's a criticism. That's the theory. We don't guide our behavior by mental representations. I don't understand how that's a criticism. That's part of the theory, right? Um, the that's like saying Einstein's work rejects Newton's work, right? It doesn't. It builds on it. It's a different theory of things, right? And so I don't quite understand that. Um, Memory, all these things, the concepts such as memory, imagery, predictions are not considered necessary or relevant. Yes, memory in the traditional way, we've talked about that before. The fact that ecological approach doesn't agree with a lot of neuroscience work, I think part of that, my response would be, a lot of neuroscience data that you want me to agree with are in simple experiments that don't have little reflection on what's going on in the sports field and complex action. They're data from people pressing keys, right? Simple tasks, people given simple tasks that don't reflect. So I don't want to try to explain those things or align with those findings. The fact that you can do a mental representation or can do an imagery doesn't mean that you do use it, to me. So I don't really think I have to align. And there is a segment of ecological dynamics called the radical embodied neuroscience that has tried to take a different view of neuroscience that does attempt to do this. But not having a clear rule for neuroscience and what the brain is doing is a critique that has gone through the history of ecological psychology. And it's to be expected, because we're removing the asymmetry. We don't think everything is happening in the brain. We don't fetishize the brain. So we're not going to have a huge role for it, and we're not going to talk about it all the time. Okay, but I think that's the point. The second point, another criticism of ecological psychology is its rigidity. Okay, with some advocates embrace and promote the doctrines of theory. They cite a quote from a paper that I covered in one of my earlier episodes, the 10 Commandments of Ecological Psychology, Claire Michaels' paper. Thou shalt not make unto thee any mental image or likeness of anything. No representations, period. Okay, the ecological commitment is to stand its ground, no representations, period. Again, as I expressed in the past, I don't think this is a weakness. This is part of the theory, right? Sticking to your theory is not a weakness, right? If you give me irrefutable evidence against it, then maybe I'll change. But for example, right? For me, as an example, if I'm not allowed to resort to some mental representation or eternal thing doing processing, if I'm not allowed to resort to that and say, oh, it's being done there, then what it makes me do is it takes me spend more time looking at the environment, looking at the information from the environment, right? And analyzing that. And from that, I discover more things than I would have if I could have quit early and just say it's a mental representation, right? So to me, this is a strength, this rigidity that you claim, right? So I don't see that as a weakness. Third, a refusal. Third, unfortunately, embracing such rigid positions has made it difficult to integrate ecological psychology principle with similar cognitive neuroscience and ecological theoretical approaches. For example, predictive processing. I don't get how predictive processing, remember, predictive processing is the idea that you're trying to predict the sensory feedback that you will receive from a movement. And when you have a mismatch, you change. I don't get how that is a similar theory to direct perception. It's not at all to me in my so refusal to blend theories again is not a weakness, right? It's a different theory, right? Why do we have to try to blend it? I don't get that, right? Why? What is the purpose, right? Um, to me, I got again, I don't see that as a weakness of ecological psychology and direct perception. But those are the things they point out. They don't list this, but it's very clear from their way they write that criticism, ecological dynamics is a common one we get all the time. Too much terminology. They don't say this, but then they have another paragraph in their article. For researchers and practitioners interested in understanding ecological dynamics, there are several terms and concepts that need to be grasped in order to master the application of the framework in sports settings. They include a glossary. Please note that a full account of the ecological terms and concepts in the academic literature is beyond the scope of the paper. There's too many terms. It's too complex, right? So I think subtly they're making this criticism, which I've talked about in the past. Any science involves lots of terminology, okay? Skill acquisition is a science, okay? I won't go over that again. Why is the CLA becoming so popular? They talk about it. It's funny, as again, this is where to me they're biased. Their position, but I'm biased towards ecological dynamics. I fully admit. They're biased. I think get away from it. They talk about this ecological dynamics of being an intriguing reconceptualization of skill acquisition, a unique approach. It's almost like saying it's cute, right? They're saying it seems nice, right? The phrase that they leave out for me is evidence-based, right? As I've talked about many times, I've had this website. I keep going, perceptionaction.com/comparative. That I've looked up that have keep a running tab of research that directly compared ecological-based approaches with more traditional prescriptive-based approaches, and most of them have shown advantage, right? So there's evidence to support why the CLA is becoming so popular. It's not just intriguing and unique and nice sounding. There's evidence, right? So I think I would have liked to see that brought more out in the paper. Okay. Then they get into the actual meat of the paper, and this really kind of gets this quote from the paper. Put simply, coaching under a constraints-led approach requires the coach to have or be able to develop experiential expertise. So get expertise through actually doing it, knowledge of. What type of coaching doesn't, right? What type of coaching can you just read about it and immediately be good at it, right? I don't think this is unique to the constraints-led approach at all, right? You get better from doing it. That's true of any type of coaching. So that's a weird comment to make. Again, I think they're making unfair expectations on the constraints-led approach that are not true. And I'll show you some other examples of this as I go that are not applied to other methods of coaching. Okay. So this is one of the misunderstandings that comes out in the paper. So getting more into the meat of their commentary, what they're basically commenting about in the paper, the main thrust of this paper is they want more details, more evidence, more research showing, quote, choosing which constraints to use, how much to manipulate them by, and how long to leave them in place, end quote. So they want some specifics about, okay, I should use this constraint if I want to do this. I should do this many reps with it, switch to this one at this point, right? So this is kind of letting something leak out, a misunderstanding leak out, and I'll talk about this more. They want a very deterministic view of constraints, right? This constraint will cause this, that will cause this, that will do this, right? Whereas in the ecological dynamics approach, we accept that we're a complex system, right? There, that level of determinism of the effect, cause and effect is not possible, right? So we can't give you exact specifics about what constraint to use and when, because we don't know if the interactions between the different constraints, including the individual constraints of the performer you're working with, are unpredictable, right? So we can't, so they're calling for something that's not really possible. But anyway, we'll get to that as we go. So the thrust of this paper is they put for 3 specific questions. How should ecological designers understand and address athlete errors? 2, what should ecological designers do when undesired skills emerge? Okay, we'll see. I'm not quite sure of the difference between those first two, but we'll see that in a second. And number three, how should ecological designers design in variability using constraints? Okay, so those are the three. Okay, so the first uh, question, what should ecological designers do about errors and understand errors, right? They define an error at the start. Errors are defined as momentary mismatch or difference between an intended movement pattern and a produced movement pattern, right? This is a very traditional internal model prescriptive based approach to what an error is, right? In ecological dynamics, we don't intend to produce a movement pattern. We're not intending to produce an ideal moving pattern, right? We're not intending to produce the specific technique that you taught me, right? So this kind of definition of error, it doesn't really follow an ecological approach, right? We're intending to produce a goal, an outcome, right? We're tending to get the ball in the basket, right? I'll go back to that in a second. We don't, in ecological approach, we don't intend to produce a specific movement pattern. We intend to achieve a performance goal, like shooting a three-pointer in basketball. The specific movement pattern that we use emerges through the process of self-organization with respect to the constraints, right? So the goal, we're not trying to produce a movement pattern, right? That's produce an ideal pattern. So, and any deviation from that is um, so that their definition of error is not really meaningful in the ecological dynamics approach. That's why we don't consider it, right? We're not any when a person, first of all, if there's no one ideal movement pattern, how do we know that the movement pattern that an athlete produced wasn't what their intention was, right? I don't know. I don't. There's no way I can measure your intention or goal, right? I can if I'm telling you what to produce, telling you to produce an ideal movement pattern, and then you do something different than that, then if I want to call that an error, that's going with an ideal technique approach, which is against the ecological viewpoint, right? So this concept of errors is kind of meaningless. An example I give here's my favorite recent example. So if anyone watch the Olympics, the men's basketball Olympics, right? The final game between U.S. and France. If you watch the game, Steph Curry kind of carried the U.S. team to a victory down. They sealed the victory for the U.S. by hitting 4 3-pointers, right? The last one. If you go watch the video, last shot he took. No coach in the world would tell someone to shoot like that. It was off balance, one-handed 3-pointer over 2 guys in his face, right? But he hit it, right? Is that an error? Right? Is that an error? Right? I'm sure if we're gonna is that the movement pattern he intended to produce? Right? It's certainly not on anyone's ideal of how to shoot a 3-point jump shot, right? Or anything you'd want to coach, right? It's a pattern that emerged based on the constraints, his level of fatigue, the game situation, the players in his face, that worked, right? He adapted to the constraints and he produced a movement pattern that worked, right? So in the ecological approach, that's not an error, right? So again, I don't know how this concept of an error from the ecological approach, if an error is not producing the movement pattern you intend, then yes, we don't do anything with errors because first of all, we don't know what movement pattern you tend to produce, right? We can ask, was the movement pattern that you produced an effective way to adapt to the constraints, right? So if Steph Curry had a shot the ball directly into the defender's hand or elbow, we could say, okay, maybe that's a kind of error, right? The movement pattern he came up with did not effectively adapt to the constraints. But so it's a different type of approach, right? So under traditional coaching approaches, working to identify and correct errors and thus manage the difficulty of the task for the athlete. Here, the authors are kind of confounding two things here, right? Errors and difficulty, right? Difficulty, and they're not exactly the same thing, especially the way they define errors. If you're defining error in terms of number of successful outcomes, number of times you get the ball in the hoop, then yes, we can manage the difficulty by moving you in, lowering the basket, the classic task simplification approach, right? So we can manage difficulty without correcting the errors in the technique, right? Constraints that approach and promote instability typically aim to promote instability. Errors are typically not addressed via direct intervention. No, right? If your error is a deviation from the ideal technique, no, we're not going to address that because we want you to explore and be able to adapt. Encouraged to embrace that there are no universal right answers to movement solutions. That's not completely true, right? There are certain invariant properties too that have to be there, and we look for those, right? That emerge and we use those to guide our behavior. For example, go back and listen to my interview with Greg Souders. Right? He doesn't let people just get on the mat and do anything, any technique they want. There's certain invariants, properties that their solution has to have. When it doesn't, he steps in and corrects, right? So we're guiding self-organization. We're not just standing back and letting athletes do anything. Okay. So I don't know why people find this so hard. I don't see it. Like I see this. I work with coaches all the time. We use constraints. That we put a constraint in to try to push the movement pattern in a certain direction. Right. If they don't, if it doesn't, we change it or we say something. Right. It's pretty. I find it pretty simple, but I guess it's different. This example they use for correcting errors. Imagine you had a field hockey player with dribbling the balls with their eyes looking down at the ball and was therefore unable to see the affordances elsewhere on the field. What should an ecological designer do? Should they consider the dribbling skill as normal variability, or is it a concern that needs to be addressed through manipulation of constraints? If this error is to be addressed, at what point should the ecological designer address it? Here we believe that having more informed guidelines about how to interpret errors and shape the performance environment accordingly would be useful for enhancing the application of constraints-led approach. Right? So first of all, I can't help but laugh at the irony of this example, right? The irony of looking down when you're dribbling, right? A thing that is massively promoted by one of the main techniques used to make tasks easier and to decompose, right? Dribbling around cones. That's your example. Okay, that's an interesting choice. Um, so what they want to say, if a performer looks down at the ball while they're dribbling, right? Um, we in an ecological approach, right? We start with the task simplification, where if we were measuring the number of times they correctly move the ball through the cone to obstacles or something, or around a player, if they have to do that initially by looking down, that's fine, right? And then we would add a constraint, right? So for example, we're focusing on the movement outcomes, not the movement patterns, right? Are they successfully getting the ball around something, right? And getting into open space, right? We were going to guide them. We're going to move them away from undesired movement pattern by destabilizing it, right? So maybe initially, so we could set up, a task where they have to dribble through some defenders, right? And imagine they could do it successfully, right? Dribble the ball all the way to the goal, right, through defenders. Imagine what we would use. Here's how I would do it. I would set up the task, and I let the 70%, the 70 and 75% rule be the guide, right? If they're be successful at the task in terms of the outcome, or at around the level we want, 70 to 75%, right? Then we're challenging them at the right level, right? If they need to look down, so if they're doing that, they're getting better than that. So we set that up initially. Imagine now they could do it almost perfectly and they're looking down while they're doing it. Well, then once they get performance level gets higher than that kind of magic level, we'd add another constraint, the chin up goggles, so they can't look down. We put they would allow the defenders to try to steal the ball from them or stand in their way, right? We could scale the equipment, right? Make the balls, buck the ball bigger so it's easier to handle, right? So there's lots of different things we could do to try to push them away from this movement solution. But there is a guide for me. It's their success rate, the performance outcomes, right? If they're achieving kind of this ideal range of success, 70-75%, that's kind of and they do that by looking down, or whatever they're doing, that's fine initially. Then we just see if they get above that, then we can add the constraints to try to change. We can add more complexity to the task, right? And try to push their movement solution in certain ways. Right. So for me, there is guidance when we focus on the outcomes, right? And we focus on guiding self-organization, right? Once a person As it reaches a certain level of performance outcome, then we can continue to guide and add more constraints to in certain ways. So that's the way I think of it anyway. Um, what should question number 2, what should ecological designers do when undesired skills emerge? I wasn't quite sure in this paper what exactly the difference between an undesired skill and error and the error is, right? Undesired fund is unwanted or unhelpful movement patterns or solutions. Wouldn't that be the same as the unintended? I'm not quite sure, but bad habits. I'll give you an example. So maybe they're in my mind a movement pattern that might cause injury, right? So maybe it's not quite the same as an error. Maybe it is a movement pattern you intended, but it's something that we want to move you away from because it might cause injury or some other problems later on. Okay. Under traditional coaching methods, something like poor footwork, inattention, cooperating with teammates or coordinated, and we give prescriptive interventions where we step in and give direct instructions when you start doing these things, right? In the ecological constraints letters is knowledge the development of stable movements. That stable movement patterns via this approach may result in increased potential for failure. As such, addressing undesired athlete skills before they become regular habits might be required sooner than later. Right. The idea is you might have to go through when you're searching for a new technique, you might go through a period of instability, something less effective, right? Again, we're going to use our kind of our performance outcome measure. That's why we don't shoot for 100% success rate. We want some errors to kind of push you and guide you, right? So focusing on the outcomes again. Okay. There's no in terms of undesired skills at present. However, it's not yet clear in the constraints-led literature how ecological designers to know if the repeated immersion of undesired skills should be considered as a functionally adaptive movement pattern or a warning sign that perhaps the athlete might be genuinely challenged to achieve a more desired functionally adaptive movement experience state. Moreover, it's similarly unclear how and when an ecological designer should intervene to shape the self-organization process and help athletes settle into a more optimal performance state. Again, for me, letting the performance outcome, that kind of 70-75% rule be your guide, right? If they're what you consider to be a undesired or maladaptive movement pattern, but they're receiving the high success rate, right? Then maybe it's in a functional movement pattern for them, right? Even though you don't like it. If they're at a high success rate, then you can add more complexity to the task, change the constraints. Is their movement pattern still so effective, right? If not, right, either that's going to their failure at the task is going to encourage them to try something else, or you can constrain to do that. Right? An example they give: imagine you have a basketball player that jumps in the air and passes while they're in the air, right? Any coach will tell you this is an undesired movement pattern, right? Because jumping while you're in the air and deciding when you're passing when you're in the air increases the chance you're going to get a turnover, right? Because you can't come back down on the ground and not pass. It's that's a foul. You're going to lose the ball. That's a double dribble or travel, and so you need to have it's giving you very little time to make a decision about where to pass to, and it's kind of pressuring you into making a pass that you might not want to. So it's increasing the chance you're going to commit a turnover. So most coaches will try to push athletes away from this. But for some highly skilled athletes, maybe this is an adaptive solution, right? Should the ecological designer, quote, in such situations, should the ecological designer consider this tendency as a functional adaptive movement pattern or an undesired skill that needs to be addressed via the manipulation of constraints? If this movement pattern is to be changed, how and when should the ecological designer do it, right? When? Again, we can look at the success rate, right? If the performer is doing that, if you have a player on your team that's jumping in the air to pass, and 7 out of 10 times or 8 out of 10 times the ball is going to their teammate, right? Then it's a successful movement pattern. We don't really need to do anything, right? We can let that. It's a functional movement pattern, adaptive movement pattern for that player, right? If they're getting that level, we can add complexity. We could add more players. We could add, instead of just 3-on-3, 5-on-5. We could add a shot clock. We could add more complexity to the task, change the task constraints to be more game-like. If they still have a very high success rate, maybe we want to leave that, right? We're just assuming that's a bad movement pattern. Maybe it's going to be an effective adaptive solution for them, right? In most cases, it probably won't. Most cases, if we put 5-on-5 with a shot clock and all this and faster players and things like that, they are going to start committing two turnovers. Their success rate is going to go down. What's going to motivate them to try something else, right? We could also help guide that by adding further constraints, right? We can make a rule that you lose a certain number of points every time you make a turnover, right? So to disincent, to make it ball security and emphasis, right? Not turning over the ball and emphasis, we could kind of make it so that this kind of risky behavior, we discourage and we encourage them to use a more effective movement solution, right? So again, by guiding by the success rate and the outcomes, I think it tells me when I want to change the constraint, right? And how I change the constraint is the basic logic of the constraints that approach. What can I add to practice that's going to move them away from the solution, right? What can I add to practice such that the jumping in the air passing solution is not effective anymore, right? Or is at least discouraged, right? So a rule or some other thing like that, right? Um, that's so when the performance starts to go above or below, depending on what you're trying to achieve, this kind of magic 70 to 75% success rate. That's when I want to start. That's when I want to step in and do something else. How, again, the basic logical constraints that approach. So that's how I would address that. Okay. So again, I think there is guidance, right? I think, the just have to kind of think through it and be responsive to what you're seeing. Okay. The third question: how should ecological designers design in variability using constraints? Quote, on the surface, the constraints that approach to provide the supportive, straightforward theoretical framework on how to design modified games and repetitive skill activities that afford the athletes to opportunity for skill development. However, when looking at the empirical evidence, there's little guidance to help ecological designers to decide what type of constraint to design in, how long to leave that constraint in for, and when to manipulate, change, or add in extra constraints. Again, I have a little bit of an issue with this because you're looking for a deterministic solution for a complex system, right? You're asking me to tell you what exactly will constraint should I add to cause this? When should I stop using it, right? Again, what type of constraint should I design in? Anyone, right? As we've kind of emphasized when we talk about this within groups, right? The constraints-led approach to coaching is an iterative one. You just have to try stuff. I guarantee you, if you try it, you will design a constraint that doesn't work at all. I guarantee you, it happens to everyone, me included, right? So I try a constraint. So let me walk you through an example, right? So I was working with a pitcher a couple of weeks ago when that has a problem where their back foot is coming off the rubber, the little piece of wood that a pitcher stands against when they're throwing, right? So essentially what they're doing is they're losing contact with the ground, right? So they're not transferring the force effectively through their back leg into their delivery. So that it doesn't let them throw as hard, right? So that's kind of a flaw, invariant they're violating, right? For me, right? People are probably going to say, "Oh, that sounds like you're talking about a ideal technique." No, they could do lots of different things with their back foot, right? They could push down on their toe. They could, push in their heel. There's lots of different ways they can do it. I just want them to stay connected to the ground in some way. Right? They could bend their knee more. So I'm not looking for an ideal, perfect way your foot should be positioned. What I'm looking for is to stay connected with the ground, right? Transfer force through the ground. So I'm looking for an attractor, an invariant property, right? So I'm starting with that. So what we tried was to put a little kind of ramp thing under their heel, right? So they had to kind of, that was their under their back heel. So they kind of had to push down to hold the ramp down. Okay. So we put that in. We had them throw. We have a radar gun to look at their velocity. We can measure how often their foot comes disconnected from the ground. So how long do we leave that constraint in for? We leave that we put that constraint in, right? Then what I do is look for, give him, at least a few trials, 5 or 6, or even more. Is there any evidence that's encouraging a change in their movement solution, right? Are they doing the exact same thing? Is the movement solution they're doing, right? Um, are they changing their movement solution? Are they exploring new ways to do their delivery? Is it kind of in the general area I want, right? Are they staying more connected? Then I leave it in, okay? When to manipulate them, right? When to manipulate them once they start to show kind of they look like they're staying more connected with the ground. I can measure this with by motion tracking. I can get very specific about this if I want, measuring the radar gun, things like that. So I'd leave it in until I see some stability. They're exploiting this new solution. When to manipulate, right? When to manipulate. If they're having trouble finding a new solution, that's when I like to step and manipulate. For example, I can use different heights of these little ramps behind their foot, right? If it's not working at all, then I completely change. I think of something else I need to do, right? Maybe I put something, they have to step over, right? Or they have to, step over a hurdle while they're going down the mountain. So I can add in a different constraint. Or I might combine that with the thing, right? So again, I know people are frustrated because I can't give you specifics of when to do this, right? Because there are none. I don't think there are none. I can't say use this for 10 trials, then switch to this, then do that, right? Because it all depends on the individual, right? It's complete. The outcome of how people adapt to constraints is completely unpredictable in a complex system, right? You have to use your experience and observation and become good at manipulating these constraints and recognizing when the constraint. You have to develop this experiential knowledge we were talking about at the start. Okay. Here's an example they give. Imagine you're coaching a football team. Okay, they're talking about soccer. For the first time, how do you know how to set up practice? Okay, under traditional coaching, right, they give you a detailed list of specific skills and drills you can implement, right? Of course, the to help guide the process. In contrast, if the parent wanted to adopt a constraints-led approach to athlete skill development, they'd be required to figure out what affordances are available to the athletes, the performance environment, and how to dynamically manipulate the environment, tasks, and personal constraints in order to shape skill development. So they need to learn about all this before they could use it, right? I don't. I think you're overselling the difficulty of doing this. Affordance, opening for a pass, opening for a shot, right? Opportunity to throw the ball, opportunity to catch the ball. Right? I don't think we need to overcomplicate the affordance. And then, as I said, just try to think about things that might encourage, right? Less players down the field is going to encourage you to throw, for example, in American football. Less big opening is to encourage you to run through, right? I don't think we need to overcomplicate a thing, right? And there's an increasing number of resources to try to understand this. So I don't think you need to go through. You can't try to implement this at all but without understanding 100% what an affordance is and all the, I think we can understand it on a kind of a very basic level and start manipulating these things, constraints, right? In the environment, manipulating small-sided games, the number of players, the spacing, right? To do this, I think there is a lot of guidance out there already, and I think we're overselling the difficulty. Another quote, in consideration, we suggest that instead of ecological designers having to make their best guess as to how much variability to design into the performance environments, more guidance be given about how to correctly identify the critical information to implement the constraints-led approach, particularly for these less familiar with the underlying aspects of the approach, right? So yeah, I kind of laugh at this. You mean I expect you to understand the method before you can use it? That seems pretty obvious. You can't, as Franz Bosch likes to say, you can't learn brain surgery in a weekend course, right? You need to understand something, what you're trying to achieve, what a constraint is. That's why I keep using the word constraints. We don't say a condition or other things. Constraint has a specific meaning. So to understand what it is gives you some guidance on how to implement it. I don't think it's that complicated. The variability issue, how much variability of practice? How many different, if I'm teaching kids how to shoot basketball, for example, which I did this, how many different angles or distances should I have them shoot from? How much variability of practice? Again, it depends on the outcome, right? So I was coaching, as I mentioned, I was coaching basketball this year, and I had lots of different kids on my team. We had on our team kids that are hitting layups every time, right? We add more variability to conditions. We start to defend them. We force them to different angles. We make them shoot a jump shot instead in their face. We give them a bad pass, right? A low pass they have to pick up. A different kid that's struggling to make any layups, we reduce the variability, right? They bring in their own inherent variability. They're not achieving that success rate we want, the 70% rule. So we reduce the variability we're adding for practice to try to get them up, right? So again, I think there is some guidance here if we focus on the right thing. Stop focusing on the technique, what the athlete is doing, right? Focus on the outcomes. Focus on letting them adapt and self-organize, right? Um, at the same time, if we focus on a specific technique, focus on the invariants. What are the key things that need to be there, and coach around those, coach the guide towards those. Okay. Um, and also I have this kind of questions raised in this paper. They're not giving you don't have enough information about how many repetitions, when to switch constraints, how much variability to add. What if all the athletes I'm coaching are not improving at the same rate? Aren't those questions also for traditional coaching, right? That there's not a lot of guidance. You have to kind of figure out on your own. Right? When I set up a passing drill, right, in American football, how long should I do it? 20 minutes? 10 minutes? Do- How many reps, right? When should we switch to doing running plays next or kicking, right? How much variability should I add? What if one of the athletes on my team is a superstar, can make one-handed catches, and one other one can barely catch a ball at all? What do I do there, right? That's the art of coaching for me, right? That's the art of coaching. And this is an interesting example they chose because this is a problem I'm facing right now. So I'm just getting ready to coach my stepson's flag football team. And there's an app for the coaches called Mojo. Within the app, there's lots of tools for coaches, right? There's lots of practice skills and drills, practice plans. Like, for example, showing here's one page to show practice plans. There's drills for defense, running, flag pulling, handoffs, receiving. And within them, they have a whole bunch of videos. They show you the drills, right? And then there's some guidance on which drills are meant for lesser skill and which one but it's very rough, right? Which combination of these should I use? When should I move from the basic drill to the advanced drill, right? The same type of questions you just raised about the constraints-led approach, I think still exist in the traditional coaching as well. So I think it's a little unfair to just exclusively put this on the constraints-led approach. Okay, so I'll tell you how this goes for me, right? So I think overall, this paper I think is interesting, right? I think there's some issues, right? I think a lot of people, and these authors included, are frustrated with the fuzziness and the uncertainty around constraints, right? Us saying just guess what constraint might work best to start with, and then try and see what happens, right? That is a deliberate that's deliberate in ecological dynamics, right? That's a feature of the constraints-led approach, not a bug in it, right? Because we are accepting the fact that human beings are a complex system, right? We're not denying that. We're embracing the messiness of it. We're not giving you the false hope that if you do this, then this will happen, because we can't guarantee it, right? There's a fundamental, I think people that are looking for this type of prescriptive rules about how to use constraints have a fundamental misunderstanding of the causality that goes on, right? Constraints don't cause behavior, right? Adding this constraint doesn't cause this behavior, right? It's way more complicated than that, right? Adding this constraint interacts with all the other constraints that might cause this behavior to merge or another behavior to merge, right? Anyone that's actually done this has experienced this also, right? Where you set up a practice activity with the hope of getting people to pass the ball more, and instead it leads to this other people taking this affordance, and you kind of run with it, right? The other kind of frustrating thing is, people are calling for more research on how to use the constraints-led approach and how to use it effectively. And at the same time, they're complaining that most research is not useful because it's not context specific, right? It's not specific to my sport. The same is going to be true of any constraints-led approach. Like, I've done tons of I have a bunch of papers on constraints-led approach in baseball, right? And I manipulate constraints about like how the height of the fence you hit over, the barrier, whether you use a connection ball, all these kind of different constraints, Is that gonna tell us much about playing football or soccer? Maybe there's some general principles, but to truly understand the constraint set approach, you need sport-specific knowledge, right? You need to understand the invariant properties of a good movement solution, right? And then you understand how that can be, how that can be guided by use of constraints, right? So I think, you know, although I'm sympathetic to some of these questions raised in the paper, I think, again, it's this kind of, we can't, there's only so much knowledge about the constraints that approach we can give you, right? You have to gain knowledge of it. You have to try it. You have to use it. You have to get in there and do it to get good at it, like almost everything in life, right? So the coaching and constraints that approach is follows the same kind of rules and beliefs as the how we think the athlete is doing, right? The importance of knowledge of. So I think there's some interesting questions raised, and there's some things maybe we could provide more data on for example, the how do we get people out of unwanted patterns, for example, ones that might cause injuries. I think that's a fair question. In my book, as I said, I'm going to address that. Meanwhile, speaking of, I should mention my book, the book I have next book I have coming out, which is focusing on coaching the ecological approach, so addressing some of these same issues. I originally had intended for September 15th. Unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to hit that deadline. I ran into a few production delays, but also mostly some of these papers that have come out recently. I decided I really important for me. I want to try to address things like this paper, things like papers that are promoting a mix and match theoretical approach. I really want to address those in this book and talk about them. And so I think hopefully, my aim is by the end of the year. So if you pre-ordered it, I'm sorry that's been canceled, but watch for a new link for that. That I really want to try to address these and provide some guidance through examples. Again, it's not going to be the kind of guidance they're asking for in this paper where I give you this a prescriptive rules for how to use constraints. We're never going to get that in the ecological approach, right? So, but through examples and through discussion of how to identify invariants, things like that, I'm going to try to address some of these issues. So keep an eye out for that book coming soon. So thanks for joining me today. Cheers for now, and keep them coupled.